The sky changed. Morning light over Pearl Harbor, sirens, smoke, disbelief. Cutting through it all, a formation of sleek fighters marked with the rising sun. They moved like predators, fast, precise, unshakable. In minutes, the world learned a new name, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. To shell-shocked observers, it felt invincible. It climbed harder, turned tighter, and struck with a ruthlessness the West hadn't prepared for. But buried inside that terrifying debut was a flaw waiting to be exposed. A design philosophy so extreme, it would eventually turn triumph into vulnerability. The Zero didn't appear out of nowhere. It was the product of a national obsession. Japan, once dismissed as a maker of cheap imitations, had forced the world to reconsider. In 1937, its Navy demanded the impossible, a carrier fighter that could outmaneuver anything in the air, fly deep without refueling, and still hit like a hammer. Jiro Horikoshi and his team answered by throwing out the rule book. Strip weight, reduce drag, polish the skin until air slid off it like water. What they built was a razor-thin, elegant, deadly. By the time the Pacific War exploded, that razor was carving through the sky. Early Allied pilots tried to fight the Zero the old way, turn with it, dogfight it, outfly it on instinct, and paid for those mistakes in fire and twisted metal. Reports came back with grim consistency. It climbed like a rocket, turned inside anything, and appeared where no one expected it, thanks to range that stretched logic. The message filtered up through command rooms and briefing tents alike. Whatever the Zero was, it broke the assumptions that Western air forces lived by. But here's the paradox. The very choices that made the Zero terrifying also made it fragile. Speed and range had been purchased at a price. Armor left out. Tanks that didn't protect themselves. Control forces that grew stiff and stubborn at high speed. Those trade-offs were invisible on December 7th. They were invisible in the early months of 1942. And yet they were there, written into the airframe like a secret. All that was needed was proof, and a set of hands willing to pull the thread. That proof wouldn't come from a lab. It wouldn't come from rumor or guesswork. It would come from an accident on a lonely strip of tundra, where a young pilot made a split-second decision and sealed the fate of his machine. A single crash on a remote Alaskan island would become the Allies' most valuable gift. An intact Zero, preserved by mud to innovation. For centuries, Japan lived in self-imposed isolation, closed off from the West. When its doors finally opened in the mid-1800s, the nation rushed to catch up with industrial powers that had been refining technology for generations. At first, made in Japan was shorthand for cheap and fragile. Western powers laughed off Japanese craftsmanship as imitation rather than innovation. But by the 1930s, that perception was already outdated, and dangerously so. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero would be the proof. Its birth came in 1937, when the Imperial Japanese Navy issued a set of requirements so ambitious, many thought they were delusional. The Navy wanted a carrier-based fighter with blistering speed, unmatched maneuverability, enormous range, and real striking power. No Western fighter combined all of those qualities. Most designers would have responded with compromise, sacrifice range for protection, speed for agility.
But Mitsubishi's young engineer, Jiro Horikoshi, had no interest in compromise. Horikoshi believed that if Japan was going to challenge the world's best, it had to ignore conventions. He made bold choices: flush riveting to smooth the skin, elliptical wings for lift and elegance, aluminum structures that cut every unnecessary ounce. Where Western fighters were heavy and protected, the Zero was light and unarmored. It wasn't designed to absorb punishment. It was designed to avoid being hit in the first place. Horikoshi called it balance. Critics might have called it gambling. The gamble paid off. On April 1st, 1939, the prototype A6M took to the air and stunned observers. It wasn't just fast. It could climb with a ferocity that left other fighters behind. Its controls were light, its turn radius unmatched, and its range seemed endless. Suddenly, the phrase "made in Japan" meant something else: precision, danger, mastery. The Zero wasn't an imitation. It was a revelation. The Navy knew it had something extraordinary, but the world at large didn't notice, at least not yet. In China, the Zero made its combat debut in 1940, sweeping skies clear of obsolete biplanes and clumsy monoplanes. Pilots in the Chinese Air Force reported battles where their best maneuvers were useless, their weapons impotent against the agile new Predator. Allied observers took note but didn't truly understand. Reports of a lightweight, high-performing Japanese fighter sounded exaggerated, almost impossible. Few believed Japan could field anything that rivaled Western engineering. That disbelief would prove costly. By late 1941, Japan had fewer than 300 Zeros, carefully allocated among its carriers and frontline harbor.
As Zeros roared over Oahu on December 7, 1941, the world's illusions shattered. Western commanders realized too late that they had underestimated Japan's engineers and the men who flew their creations. But Pearl Harbor was only the opening note. The months that followed would see the Zero dominate every battlefield it entered, humbling Allied pilots again and again. And still, hidden inside its brilliance, the weaknesses waited. Fire in the Pacific skies. When the first waves of Zeros swept into Pearl Harbor, the shock was only beginning. In the months that followed, the Pacific skies belonged almost entirely to Japan. The Zero wasn't just winning dogfights, it was rewriting the rules of aerial warfare. Allied pilots, used to heavy, rugged fighters like the P-40 Warhawk or the P-35, suddenly found themselves flying machines that felt sluggish and unresponsive against Japan's new Predator. Reports poured in from every front. Zeros could climb faster, turn tighter, and strike deeper than anything the Allies could field. Its long range allowed it to escort bombers far into enemy territory, showing up in places where defenders least expected fighter cover. American pilots called it the most dangerous thing in the sky. Some units saw loss ratios that felt like slaughter. Early estimates suggested a 12-to-1 kill ratio in favor of the Zero, an unheard-of statistic in modern air combat. What made the Zero so untouchable? Its design philosophy. Weighing just 3,700 pounds empty, it carried an agility advantage no Western plane could match. Its 20-millimeter cannons shredded enemy aircraft in seconds, while its machine guns laid down constant streams of fire. And with over 1,900 miles of range, it could appear where Allied defenses felt secure, turning safety into sudden terror. But the truth was more complicated. The Zero's dominance was not just about technology, It was about the men in the cockpit. Japan's pilot training program was brutal, selective, and designed to produce masters of their craft. Pilots averaged 600 hours of flight time before seeing combat, with leaders boasting well over 1,500. They weren't just flying superior machines, they were experts at wringing every ounce of performance from them. Against unprepared and undertrained Allied flyers, the result was inevitable. Yet even in these early days, cracks were showing. Pilots like Claire Chennault of the American Volunteer Group, the famous Flying Tigers in China, began to study the Zero's patterns. They noticed its weaknesses: sluggish controls at high speeds, a tendency to stall under negative Gs. Pilots, it was the enemy's scythe, slicing through formations with deadly grace. And to strategists, it was a question mark. How long could this dominance last, and what would it take to shatter it? Because as unstoppable as the Zero seemed in early 1942, history has a way of punishing extremes. The very features that made it a predator were the same features that made it fragile. And when fate delivered one nearly intact to the Americans, the unraveling of its legend began. Built to win, doomed to break. The brilliance of the Zero's design lay in what it left out. Jiro Horikoshi and his team had trimmed every possible ounce to give their fighter unmatched agility and range. But in doing so, they made decisions that would eventually turn from strength into liability. Early victories masked these flaws, but the cracks were already there, hidden beneath the aircraft's polished skin. Armor was the most obvious omission. While Allied fighters increasingly wrapped their pilots in steel plating and bulletproof glass, the Zero offered little more than thin aluminum. In combat, that meant even small-caliber rounds could puncture fuel tanks or cut vital lines. What's more, those fuel tanks weren't self-sealing. A single tracer round could ignite them, and once flames spread, there was little a Zero pilot could do but brace for impact. Stories circulated of Zeros erupting in fireballs after only a few hits, a brutal contrast to the reputation of invincibility they carried in 1941. Then came the control problem. At low speeds, the Zero was untouchable, dancing through the air with unmatched elegance. But in high-speed dives, the control surfaces stiffened like iron bars. Without hydraulic boosts, pilots had to fight the stick with their own strength, sometimes so much that pulling out of a dive was impossible. To skilled opponents, that weakness was gold. Attack from above, dive fast, and the Zero couldn't follow. Even the engine held a trap. The Nakajima Sakai radial was powerful for its size but carried a carburetor flaw. Under negative Gs, it would flood and cut out. Allied pilots learned quickly. Flip your fighter into a sudden negative dive, and the pursuing Zero's engine would choke, leaving its pilot helpless until the carburetor refueled. These weaknesses weren't yet common knowledge in 1941 and early 1942. Allied flyers were still learning the hard way, dogfighting and losing. But the seeds of counter-tactics were sprouting. Chennault's Flying Tigers taught their men, don't turn with a Zero, use altitude, hit once and dive away. Guerrilla-style air combat, not drawn-out duels. It was advice that would later be adopted across the Pacific once proof of the Zero's limits became undeniable. And that proof was about to come from the not burn, would not shatter. Instead, it would fall into American hands almost intact. In its rivets, wires, and fuel lines lay the answers to the Zero's mystery, and the key to bringing it down. The Zero was still feared, still dominant, but its fatal flaws were about to be exposed in the most dramatic way possible.
June 1942. While the eyes of the world were fixed on Midway, another battle was playing out far to the north, in the icy Aleutian Islands of Alaska. The Japanese had launched a diversionary assault, hoping to split American forces. Among the aircraft involved were Mitsubishi Zeros from the carrier Ryujo. One of them was flown by a 19-year-old pilot named Tadayoshi Koga. His mission? Strafe defenses at Dutch Harbor. His fate? To alter the course of the Pacific War in a way he could never have imagined. During the raid, Koga's Zero was hit by ground fire. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but it left him struggling to keep the fighter airborne. Knowing he couldn't make it back to his carrier, Koga and his wingmen searched desperately for a landing site. Then they spotted it, what looked like a flat meadow on nearby Akutan Island. To Koga, it seemed like salvation. He lowered his gear and brought the Zero down. But appearances deceive. The lush green field wasn't solid ground at all. It was a bog, a soft, treacherous carpet of moss and mud. As the Zero's wheels touched down, they sank deep. In an instant, the fighter flipped forward, slamming nose first into the earth before rolling onto its back. Koga was killed instantly. His wingmen, under orders not to let a Zero fall into enemy hands, circled helplessly. They couldn't destroy the wreck without exposing themselves to American patrols. Reluctantly, they left it behind. What they abandoned was no ordinary wreck. Miraculously, the soft earth that killed Koga had also saved his aircraft. The Zero lay inverted but mostly intact, its wings unbroken, its fuselage preserved. The bog had cushioned the crash, preventing the fire or destruction that usually followed a downed plane. For weeks it sat hidden and forgotten in the Alaskan wilderness, a silent prize waiting to be claimed. That prize would soon be discovered. On July 10, 1942, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina on patrol spotted the overturned aircraft. When American forces reached the site, they realized what they had: the first nearly complete, flyable Zero captured by the Allies. In an instant, a legend wrapped in mystery became a machine ready for dissection. The Zero, designated Koga's Zero by the Zero's secrets, once uncovered, would give birth to new tactics, new fighters, and a reversal of fortunes in the skies of the Pacific. If Koga's Zero had burned in that bog, would Japan's air dominance have lasted much longer? Unlocking the secrets. When the salvaged Zero finally reached San Diego, engineers and test pilots approached it with a mix of awe and urgency. For nearly a year, Allied reports about Japan's new fighter had been full of contradictions. Some claimed it was impossibly fast. Others swore it could outturn anything in the air. But now, the truth could be measured, not guessed. The wreck from Akutan was restored to flying condition, given the serial number 4593, and prepared for systematic testing. On September 20th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders climbed into its cockpit for the first test flight under American colors. What followed were 24 sorties between September and October, each one designed to probe the Zero's capabilities, and more importantly, its limits. Sanders and his colleagues didn't just fly it, they dissected it in the sky, forcing it through dives, rolls, and high-speed maneuvers while taking meticulous notes. The results confirmed what some Allied pilots had suspected, but many commanders had doubted. The Zero was lethal, but only under the right conditions. At low to medium speeds, it was a ballet dancer,
able to twist inside any opponent. But above 300 miles per hour, its controls stiffened dangerously. In dives, pilots needed brute strength just to keep it level. Worse still, it rolled easily to the left, but resisted to the right, creating a predictable pattern an enemy could exploit. And the biggest flaw of all? The lack of protection. No armor for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks. A few well-placed bullets could turn the feared fighter into a fireball. This intelligence changed everything. American squadrons were immediately briefed on the findings. The new doctrine was clear. Never turn with a Zero. Attack from above, hit hard, dive away, and force it into high-speed combat where it was clumsy. Pilots began practicing boom and zoom tactics, striking like hawks instead of sparrows. Suddenly, survival rates climbed. Encounters that once ended in disaster now ended in victory. The Zero's mystique, its aura of invincibility, was fading. With every test flight, Sanders and his team stripped away another layer of legend, until only the machine remained. And once the Allies knew the machine, they could beat it. But the impact of Koga's Zero didn't stop at tactics of strength. From a muddy bog in the Aleutians to test flights over California, the Zero's secrets had been unlocked. And those secrets would help turn the tide of a war. By Hellcat Rises. By the time engineers finished studying Koga's Zero, the American aviation industry was already moving at full throttle. Factories that once built cars and farm equipment now churned out warplanes by the thousands. And when Grumman Aircraft received the intelligence gathered from the captured Zero, they knew exactly what to do with it. The result was the F-6F Hellcat, a fighter built not to match the Zero on its own terms, but to crush it where it was weakest. The Hellcat was everything the Zero wasn't. Heavily armored, its cockpit shielded the pilot from gunfire that would have shredded a Japanese flyer. Its self-sealing fuel tanks meant that a lucky hit wouldn't ignite the plane in flames. And under its cowling roared a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine. An 18-cylinder beast producing 2,000 horsepower, more than twice the output of the Zero's lightweight Sake. The Hellcat wasn't delicate. It was brutal. In the air, the differences were obvious. A Zero could still outturn a Hellcat in a slow dogfight, but the Americans no longer played by those rules. They attacked from above, dove through, and let their heavier guns and speed do the work. If a Zero pilot tried to escape by rolling left, Allied flyers knew to anticipate it. If they tried a high-speed dive, their stiff controls worked against them. And when the Zero's guns ran dry after only a minute of firing, the Hellcat still had plenty to give. Combat results spoke for themselves. By late 1943, as Hellcats rolled off assembly lines and into squadrons, the balance of the Pacific skies shifted dramatically. In engagement after engagement, Zeros fell in staggering numbers. The kill ratio flipped. What had once been a 12-to-1 advantage for Japan became the exact opposite for the United States. The feared hunter had become the hunted. But it wasn't just the machine. It was also the men. American pilot training programs expanded at a pace Japan couldn't hope to match. While Japanese trainees struggled with fuel shortages and rushed instruction, American rookies logged hundreds of hours before ever seeing combat. And when they entered the fight, they were flying planes built with the knowledge of exactly how to counter their enemy. By 1944, the skies over the Pacific were no longer the realm of the Zero. The Hellcat, the Corsair, and a flood of other Allied aircraft had taken command. What began as Japan's symbol of aerial supremacy had was fighting a war it had not been designed to win. Once a symbol of Japanese mastery, it now faced opponents that were faster, tougher, and flown by pilots who knew its every flaw. The lessons from Koga's Zero had spread through every Allied squadron. The old fear was gone. In its place was cold precision. The Japanese tried to adapt. Newer Zero models were fitted with armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, features Western fighters had carried from the start. But every improvement came with a price. Added armor made the Zero heavier. Self-sealing tanks cut into its precious range. The delicate balance Horikoshi had built, agility over protection, was upset. What emerged were Zeros that no longer turned as gracefully, yet still lacked the power to match American engines. In trying to fix the flaws, Japan had stripped away the qualities that once gave the fighter its edge. Pilot training also collapsed under the weight of war. In the pre-war years, Japan's program had been brutally selective, producing aviators with 600, sometimes 1,500 hours in the cockpit before combat. But by 1943, the empire could no longer afford such luxury. Fuel shortages, combat losses, and the sheer speed of war forced shortcuts. New pilots went into battle with fewer than 100 hours of flight time, many barely familiar with the Zero they flew. They faced Americans who now averaged more training hours, more combat experience, and better aircraft. The result was devastating. The statistics told the story. In battle after battle, Zeros were destroyed at staggering rates. The famed 12-to-1 kill ratio of early 1942 flipped on its head. Now Hellcats and Corsairs tore through Japanese formations, sometimes wiping out entire units in a single engagement. The once invincible Zero was reduced to a fragile, expendable tool in a war of attrition Japan could not hope to win. By mid-1944, this decline reached a brutal climax in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Known to Americans as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, it was the day the Zero's legend died. Over 300 Japanese planes were destroyed in a single day, most of them Zeros, falling in droves to disciplined American pilots. For Japan, it was more than a defeat. It was the collapse of the fighter force that had once ruled the Pacific. The Zero had started the war as the terror of Allied skies, but by the middle of it, it had become a tragic example of overreach. Brilliant in its debut, brittle in the long haul, doomed by the very compromises that made it revolutionary. Do you think the Zero could have stayed dominant if Japan produced elite aviators was shattered? With inexperienced pilots, flying outclassed machines against seasoned American aces, losses mounted at a pace no nation could endure. In that crucible of desperation, the Zero was given a new role, one it had never been designed for. Beginning in the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japan launched the first organized kamikaze missions. Light, long-ranged, and still able to carry small bombs, the Zero became the weapon of choice for suicide attacks. No longer the elegant duelist of 1941, it was now a blunt instrument of terror. For the men chosen to fly these missions, the Zero was both coffin and sword. They were young, many barely trained, handed a machine that had once been the pride of their nation and told to crash it deliberately into enemy ships. Against the might of American fleets, the tactic was horrifyingly effective in the short term. Kamikaze Zeros punched holes into carriers, destroyers, and troop transports, killing thousands. Each attack was meant to shock, to break American morale, to remind the enemy that Japan would not surrender quietly. But like the Zero itself, the tactic carried built-in limits. For every ship damaged, hundreds of young pilots were lost forever. The attrition only deepened Japan's collapse. What had once been a fighter force symbolizing mastery of the skies was reduced to waves of sacrificial strikes. The Zero's identity had shifted from predator to desperation weapon, its graceful lines now synonymous with fire, smoke, and tragic futility. To American sailors and pilots, the kamikaze raids were terrifying, but they also underscored Japan's weakness. An enemy that resorts to suicide attacks has already admitted defeat in conventional battle. The same airframe that once outclassed every Western fighter had been forced into a role it was never intended for. It was a bitter, ironic end for one of the most advanced aircraft of its era. The kamikaze era of the Zero sealed its place in history, not only as a revolutionary fighter but as a symbol of a nation pushed to extremes, willing to sacrifice everything in a war it could no longer win. Legacy of a legend. When the war ended in 1945, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero was no longer the terror that had haunted Allied skies. Most had been shot down, destroyed on the ground, or expended in kamikaze missions. The aircraft that once carried Japan's hopes of aerial supremacy was now a relic of a defeated empire. Yet its story didn't vanish with the war's end. It left behind a legacy as complex as it was dramatic. Technically, the Zero had been revolutionary. It showed the world what was possible when agility and range were prioritized above all else. Its design influenced not just Japanese aviation but also Allied engineers who studied stiffness at high speeds, became textbook examples in aviation schools of what to avoid in future fighter designs. Culturally, the Zero became a paradox. In Japan, it was remembered as a symbol of ingenuity and national pride, but also as a reminder of the human cost of war. To the Allies, it represented both fear and triumph. Fear in the early months when it ruled the skies, and triumph when its secrets were unlocked and its dominance broken. Strategically, the Zero's rise and fall embodied the larger story of World War II in the Pacific. At first, Japan seemed unstoppable, fueled by surprise and innovation. But as the war dragged on, America's industrial might, pilot training programs, and ability to adapt quickly overwhelmed Japan's early advantage. The Zero went from predator to prey, from innovator to obsolete, in just a few short years. Even today, surviving examples of the Zero, few and precious, draw fascination. Restored aircraft fly at air shows, their elegant lines reminding spectators of a time when the world watched them with fear. Historians debate whether Horikoshi's uncompromising vision was brilliance or recklessness. Pilots who faced the Zero never forgot it. Some respected it, many feared it, and all agreed it changed the way wars were fought in the air. The Zero's legacy is not just that of a machine. It is the story of how technology, strategy, and human determination collide in times of conflict. It proved that even the most feared weapon can be undone when its secrets are revealed, its weaknesses exploited, and its legend stripped away. From the skies over Pearl Harbor to the mud of Akutan Island, the Mitsubishi Zero carved its name into history, not as an invincible champion, but as a legend that rose, burned brightly, and then fell. Do you see the Zero today as a symbol of genius design, or as a cautionary tale of innovation pushed too far?